terrifying reality of my life isn't a ghost or a monster, but the fact that I am trapped in a room where the only thing more dangerous than the walls is my own mind. It all started on a rainy Tuesday 10 years ago when the brakes of our SUV failed on the mountain pass, and I watched the steering wheel slip through my fingers while my husband screamed my name. I woke up in a white room with a nurse named Alina, who leaned over me with a tray of pills and a smile that never reached her cold eyes. She told me I had a severe head injury and that I needed to stay calm because my husband was standing right outside the heavy steel door waiting for me to recover. Every morning at exactly 8 o'clock, I heard the distinct sound of his knuckles rapping against the wood, and his voice muffled but clear, calling out that he loved me and was waiting. Alina would press a syringe into my IV line and explain that I couldn't see him yet because my agitation would trigger a seizure that could permanently damage my brain. I spent months staring at that door while the sounds from the hallway grew more frequent and more desperate, as if he were trying to kick the frame down to reach me. The danger intensified when the doctors started increasing my dosage, and the walls of the room began to feel like they were closing in on my physical body. I stopped eating and started hiding my pills under my tongue because the urge to reach the man on the other side of that door was the only thing keeping me alive. One afternoon, the nurse forgot to lock the medication cabinet, and I saw a file with my name on it that had a red, permanent stamp across the front cover. I tried to grab it, but the sound of my husband screaming my name in agony erupted from the hallway, and I threw myself against the door until my shoulder turned purple. The staff rushed in and strapped my limbs to the bed frames with leather belts, while telling me that my husband was terrified of my violent outbursts. They told me that every time I fought back, I was pushing him further away, and that he was considering leaving the hospital forever if I didn't comply. I spent the next 3 years in a chemical fog, listening to him cry through the keyhole, while I lay paralyzed by the drugs they pumped into my veins. Every time I tried to speak, my tongue felt like lead, and I could only watch as the nurse recorded my muffled groans on a small black device. I started to notice that the sounds of his footsteps never moved further down the hall, but always stayed exactly 3 inches from the threshold. The tension reached a breaking point when I realized the nurse was no longer wearing a uniform, but was dressed in heavy protective gear, as if I were a biohazard. I felt the air in the room thinning as they replaced the windows with reinforced plexiglass and removed every sharp object, including my toothbrush. The sounds of the struggle outside the door became a daily symphony of crashes and pleas that tore at my soul and made me claw at my own skin. I knew I had to escape this concrete box before the drugs completely erased my ability to stand or think for myself. That's when I thought it was over. I had no idea what was about to happen next. The story isn't over. Subscribe the channel to continue. I waited until the dead of night, when the hospital was silent, except for the rhythmic clicking of the industrial fans in the ceiling vents. I used the metal buckle of my restraint, which I had spent months loosening against the bed frame, to pick the lock on my wrist straps. My legs were weak, and my muscles screamed in protest as I dragged myself across the cold linoleum floor toward the heavy door that separated me from my husband. I reached for the handle, but my hand met a flat, cold surface that didn't feel like wood or metal at all. I threw my entire body weight against the barrier, expecting a crash. But instead, there was only the sound of glass shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. I didn't fall into a hallway or into the arms of my waiting husband, but instead, I collapsed onto a pile of silver shards in the center of a dead-end room. I looked up and saw that there was no door, and there had never been a door because the entire wall was a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror. I turned around to see a speaker mounted in the corner of the ceiling, playing a looped recording of a woman sobbing and screaming a man's name in total despair. I realized the voice wasn't my husband's voice at all, but it was a recording of my own voice from the night of the car accident. The nurse entered the room with 2 large orderly guards, and she wasn't smiling anymore as she held up the small black recorder she always carried. She played the tape, and I heard myself begging for forgiveness over the sound of crunching metal and the final silence of the man I loved. I looked at my hands and saw the scars from 10 years of self-inflicted wounds that I had completely blocked from my conscious memory. The doctors explained that my husband died instantly in the crash that I caused by driving while intoxicated. And I had been in this high-security psychiatric ward ever since. They told me the mirror was a therapeutic tool designed to force me to face the reality of my actions. But I had turned it into a portal for my delusions. I had spent a decade fighting to reach a dead man, while the hospital staff simply watched my psychological disintegration for their medical journals. There was no escape because the prison wasn't the room, but the fact that I was the one who ended the only life that mattered to me. I sat in the middle of the broken glass and picked up a sharp shard, seeing my own aged and broken face reflected in the wreckage of my lies. I didn't want to leave the room anymore because the empty hallway outside was a reminder that the world had moved on without us. I realized that the danger I felt was just my conscience trying to break through the wall of pills and denial I had built to survive. I reached out and touched the cold wall where the mirror used to be, and I finally stopped fighting the restraints when they stepped forward to take me back to the bed. I am not trying to get out of room 404 because the person who walked into this hospital 10 years ago is already gone. One last question. If you were in her place at that moment, would you have done the same? Be honest. What does her choice deserve out of 10? Subscribe now. The best story is coming next.